Director of Policy, Development and Constitutional Government at the Goldwater Institute. He led the Institute's successful challenge to Arizona's system of government campaign financing to the U.S. Supreme Court, used an emergency motion invoking the archaic All Writs Act. Nick was able to persuade the court to block campaign subsidies from being paid to government-funded candidates during the 2010 election cycle. He also serves as a constitutional scholar. He's authored scholarly articles dealing with a wide spectrum of issues in constitutional and regulatory policy. His articles have been published by leading law reviews, law journals, and think tanks all over the country. He also serves on the board of Compact for America, which is urging the states to advance the balanced budget amendment using the Interstate Compact. Let's give a warm Tea Party welcome to them.
Well, it's good to be back. It's been a couple of years since I was last here, and I want to really thank you for making time on this critical issue. Today's presentation is going to be about the state's power to originate constitutional amendments. And I want to emphasize that my goal tonight is to persuade each and every one of you that if now is not the time for Article 5, when will it ever be? I mean, if we don't have enough of a threat on the horizon to the rule of law and what remains of our Constitution such that the states should not use their fail-safe, what more would it take? You see, because it is in the Constitution. Article 5 is in the Constitution. The state's ability to originate amendments was part and parcel of the entire plan for our federal government to be used when necessary to restrain the federal government. I'm going to go through this in this presentation as to what the founders intended. And I just want to start off with just a small nugget to think about. We can't wait until we're all in chains to use this power. We can't wait until free speech disappears to use this power. We can't wait until we're completely disarmed as a populace and therefore no threat whatsoever to the political class to use this power. We have to have an environment where freedom of speech still exists, where our political voice still matters to use this power. And if it isn't now, how much longer can we afford to wait? With that being said, if I could go to the next slide, I guess I'll do myself. It's always good when talking about Article 5 to actually look at the text of the Constitution. The Constitution, actually, in Article 5, contains both modes of amending the Constitution. Now, we're all familiar with the fact that Congress has the power to originate constitutional amendments. All 27 amendments that currently have been made originated with Congress proposing them using the process outlined in Article 5. Now, just for a moment, let's step back and realize what that means. We are currently operating on Constitution version 27.0, right? And not all the amendments that Congress has proposed have been good ones. They started going off the rails after the Civil War with things like the 16th Amendment, which brought about the income tax, the 17th Amendment, which took the states out of a role in determining national policy by proxy in the U.S. Senate. And when Congress changed these two elements of the Constitution, giving the federal government the power to tax our incomes combined with removing the states from a direct role in national policy, the original design of the Constitution was fundamentally changed. So when you hear folks out there talking about, well, we just need to enforce the Constitution, I say, which version? 27.0 or the original Constitution? Because there's no way we're getting back to before the 16th and 17th Amendments without yet another amendment. That being said, take a close look at this language. Because the one most significant thing that I want to start this conversation with is that it's a single long sentence. Actually a long, very long clause ended with a semicolon. You could probably tell the founders were mostly attorneys. But what's really significant about this language is, think about it, if you were a reasonably competent draftsman, whether you were an attorney or just someone familiar with English, if you were talking about two fundamentally different amendment powers, Congress's version of amending the Constitution or the state's version of amending the Constitution, if you're talking about two fundamentally different powers, one being safe, the other one blowing up the Constitution, one being usual, normal, the other one being a threat to all of our lives and liberties, would you really describe it in the same sentence, in the same clause, in the same provision? Or is the more natural reading, just looking at the text of the Constitution, that we're talking about the same amendment power exercised in two different ways? Now, to further emphasize this, just looking at the text of Article 5, it's important to notice that both amendment powers, both from Congress and from the application of legislatures of the states, which results in a convention for proposing amendments, both of those powers and processes of proposing amendments are subject to the same ratification requirement. So think about, again, just nothing special here. I'm not getting deep into history till later, but just think about this as a textual matter. If in fact the convention for proposing amendments was an entirely different amendment power than congressional amendments, why would they be in the same sentence, in the same clause, and both modified by the same ratification process? Isn't it just on the text of Article 5, in and of itself, isn't it obvious that we're talking about the same amendment power exercised in two different ways? I also want to point out one more textual fact. Some of our friends on the center right talk about how, well, this is a convention for proposing amendments, not just one amendment, but many amendments. Take a look at Congress's power to propose amendments just preceding the convention for proposing amendments. Do you notice that, in fact, both powers to propose amendments are talking about amendments in the plural? Does anyone make a serious argument that Congress has only one choice, and that is to propose multiple amendments that can't do anything but several amendments at a time? No, nobody makes that argument, because in fact Congress has made singular amendment proposals each and every time, except maybe the Bill of Rights. Some of those might have came roughly at the same time. But the bottom line is that it is well understood to constitutional scholars and historians of the time of the founding that the plural was a common style meant to include the singular, not exclude it. And you can see that the plural proposing amendments applies to both Congress and the convention process. So there's nothing in the text of Article 5 that naturally supports the view that the convention for proposing amendments is somehow an entirely different kind of power, that is somehow completely unrestrained, and somehow forced to do nothing but multiple amendments. It's just not in the text. Now, there's even more evidence than just the text. We'll get back to that at the end of this. But first, I want to focus the mind on why it's important to look to the states for amendments instead of Congress. Because there's certain things that the federal government never will do. Congress, since the original Bill of Rights, has never tied its own hands. It has never given up more than an inch of its own power. And that inch was the repeal of prohibition. And that wasn't a whole lot of power that Congress gave up, because by the time they repealed it, we were on the verge of the New Deal revolution, and they probably could have gotten that prohibition through the Commerce Clause. Not as it was intended, but nevertheless. So the bottom line is that Congress has a conflict of interest in giving up its own power, particularly powers that it had obtained for itself through amendments. So let's imagine a world. Just imagine this world. This is just a thought experiment. Imagine a world where the states were as comfortable with organizing conventions for proposing one or more amendments as Congress has been. Let's imagine a world where the proposing of amendments by the states through conventions was as normal as a ballot measure proposal, as normal as legislation, was part of the discourse and dialogue at least as often as Congress's proposed amendment process has been, all 27 times. Just imagine that world. Imagine. Oh, by the way, everyone here remember TARP, the $750 billion slush fund that without any real judicial review or congressional review, the executive branch could operate to bail out banks? Do you remember how close that vote was? The vote in Congress had to be taken twice because it failed the first time. The polling was 80+% against passing TARP. And Congress just thumbed its nose the second time around. That tells you something about the political process if you don't use Article 5. Now imagine if instead of not using Article 5, imagine a world in which Article 5 was normal, where states originating amendments was normal. Imagine that world where 80% of the American people, blue, red, purple states, are against what Congress is about to do. Imagine that world. What if, during that debate over TARP, we didn't just wave our pitchforks at Congress? What if, in red, blue, and purple states, 47 states banned, by the way, in their state constitutions, in one way or another, subsidies to private business? 47 states. Arizona is one of them. They ban it less effectively in some places than others, but nevertheless, this is a common principle of state constitutions. So imagine a world where, within the debate going on over TARP, people were used to using Article 5, and they were slowly organizing, alongside the debate in Congress, an amendment to take away the power to bail out the banks. And imagine, with 80% of the American people having the ability now to mass behind an actual substantive reform outside of Washington. Imagine as those states ticked off 5, 10, 15 to the magic 2/3 threshold to trigger the convention call, how that might have changed those marginal votes in Washington that flipped back and forth, eventually passed TARP. Don't you think that it would, at minimum, change the political calculus of Washington if they thought that if they went against the will of the people in that way, they would lose forever the power to subsidize the banks in the future? Don't believe me yet? Think about this. Everyone here loves Obamacare, right?
Close.
I mean, it's just health reform. We need to reform our health. Our health needs reform. The federal government's the one to do it. No, I'm just kidding. Obamacare, same story as TARP. It took the Cornhusker kickback and the Louisiana Purchase to turn that vote into a win for the Obama administration when they controlled both houses of Congress. Remember how close that vote was? It took lies about keeping your doctor and lies about the ability not to pay for abortions and so forth that were made to bring in the votes, and outright near bribery, right? It was that close. It came down to a handful of votes. Now, eventually, 28 states, in one lawsuit or another, challenged Obamacare. And we know how that turned out. Not the best. But imagine, again, we were living in this mythical world where Article 5 is normal, where it's just like a ballot measure. Imagine if, as that debate took place, remember how close it was, how it came back, it went back and forth, how it really was just by 5 to 10 votes that the whole thing hung on. Imagine if the states, in sequence with that, in parallel with that, were organizing behind a healthcare freedom amendment like we have in Arizona's state constitution, where they were taking away, once and for all, the power to regulate health insurance markets from the federal government. Period. And imagine, as that midnight hour approached and all the deals that they're cutting in Washington, imagine if the 28 states that eventually, at that time we didn't know it would be that many, but imagine if the 28 states started massing towards that magic 2/3 number. So you get 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 26, 27. As those numbers are rolling in towards the amendment, don't you think that some of those marginal votes on the edges that flipped one way or the other just might have held firm? Still after this? I know we don't all agree on the NSA surveillance issue. I suspect more of us agree as time progresses that it was a bad idea for the federal government to be engaged in wholesale warrantless surveillance of everything we do on the internet and everything we do in our cell phone traffic. Well, that is another issue where you get blue, red, and purple states. It's not 80+% like under TARP, but you have a distribution of states where it's very plausible you can get to 34 states under Article 5, the 2/3 threshold. Imagine if the states started advancing today in response to Clapper's perjury, an amendment that just clarified that the Fourth Amendment's guarantee against unreasonable searches and seizures in the modern age applies to electronic communications as much as physical communications. Don't you think that the steam that could exist to carry this through would be a plausible enough threat that at minimum the talk of reform in Washington would be dramatically enhanced than not having that power being used at all. So I hope you can see from this thought experiment how powerful originating amendments to the Constitution can be from the states. So I'm going to ask you to just play along with me a little bit more, because I hope you've all seen The Patriots, or at least enough of you. Because now is the time to make a choice, the red pill or the blue pill. And I say this now because we're not too far away from the tipping point where we're just going to become Venezuela or Argentina. We're not far at all, where this debate will be ineffective at best. And we have a growing movement, not just for the compact effort that we're in favor of at the Goldwater Institute, but also other amendment efforts, such as the Convention of the States. There is a growing, massive groundswell in support of pursuing the Article 5 option. Now you can say, let's just wait a few more years and see what happens. But you can't look at the trends that we're seeing in demography and say that makes a whole lot of sense, and the trends we're seeing in politics and say that makes a whole lot of sense, or the trends in culture and say that makes a whole lot of sense. Because you know what? The left is very much aware of Article 5. Very much aware. Hawaii just passed an application to try to make Obamacare part of the Constitution. So whether we choose to use this power or not, it remains in the Constitution. We don't somehow grant ourselves immunity from that power being misused if we don't use it. And have we ever stood for unilateral disarmament? Is it wise for us not to use a political tactic that we know our political opposition will use, and will use without restraint when the numbers line up for them? I submit to you that is suicide. And the good news, though, is that we still have time to use it effectively. Here's why, and it's not good news. Folks, that is our national debt growth, in real dollar terms, projected to 2020. And you could look at this and you could say to yourself, this is a broken system. Stuff like this doesn't happen except by a structural, systematic failure. This is not an accident of politics that we have this sort of exponential growth in debt. Now you're going to say, well, you know, that's just a nominal amount. That's not adjusting for inflation or anything that gives you a sense of what that means in light of the wider economic context. Well, not so, folks. We are now today, as a percentage of gross domestic product, at about 107% of GDP, everything we produce in the country in 1 year. The last time we were there was at the height of World War II. So we've already borrowed enough of what we produce to reach levels when our very existence as a nation, if not the free world, was at stake. Now you'll see that the numbers came down afterwards, but ask yourself, some of you have enough experience to remember these days, right? What happened after World War II that explains our ability to grow out of this debt? We were the only economy standing. We were the only economy anyone could go to for manufactured goods. And you know what else? During the 1950s and 60s, we didn't have $220 trillion in unfunded entitlement programs that already mortgaged all of our future growth. So we are not in a position to replicate the growth that we experienced that got us out from underneath this wartime debt today. We are, in fact, where Greece was 6 years ago when everyone started panicking. This is a calamity waiting to happen, people. This is a calamity of magnitude that you cannot imagine. It will make 2008's crash look like nothing when China decides it's not going to buy our debt anymore. And by the way, think of it this way. Right now, China has about $1.2 trillion of the outstanding $17.5 trillion in debt. If they really wanted to hurt us, they'd just sell all that debt at a fire sale price, drive our interest rates through the roof, and make our current level of borrowing completely unmanageable for even good things like the core functions of the federal government. So we are currently in a very precarious situation. relying almost entirely on the economic self-interest of a sworn communistic enemy to keep us safe. This is not wise. Debt is more than a green eye shade issue. Debt is an existential issue for our country. Just to give you some more scale on this, we're already bankrupt. And this doesn't even count the amount of debt attributable to unfunded entitlement programs. You can see that we're spending far more than we bring in just looking at the regular debt. If you had the unfunded entitlement programs, it would be like having a $30 million mortgage and making 54 grand or 52 grand a year and spending 64,000. I mean, you just can't do this kind of stuff. This is insanity. And you're going to probably hear that it's all getting better. You know, last year it was $1.1 trillion a deficit for 1 year. This year it's $650 billion. No problem. It is a problem. Because when debt is exponentially growing like it is, outstripping what we produce like it is, without a future in which we can grow our way out of that debt, and yet we're still piling on hundreds of billions of dollars of new borrowing on top of old, this is ridiculous. It is absurd. It cannot last. Now, I know that some folks out there think that, well, hey, you know, most of that debt was the federal government doing things that were not constitutional to begin with. We can just default and feel good about it. Even if I were to agree with you that a large portion of this debt is immoral, in the sense that it originates from spending not authorized by the Constitution, the fact is, in our interconnected web of trade agreements, of diplomatic agreements, of economics, you can't default on your debt safely. You can't do it. It will crash your economy and have unintended consequences you do not want to encounter. We have an experiment underway in Argentina right before our eyes. They defaulted about 13 years ago. Within 3 years of that, because they couldn't borrow anymore, they nationalized everyone's equivalent of a 401k, took their real assets out of the retirement fund, replaced it with worthless bonds they couldn't sell anymore. Okay? Then they got chased around the world by hedge funds. They almost lost Air Force One in Africa for basically them trying to collect on the debts that they tried to default on. Even to this day, there's a federal court that is engaged in seizing various government pension fund assets in Argentina to try to recoup all of this debt that they thought they could default on. And they're still boxed out of so many trade agreements that their economy has just been a continuous disaster for 13 years with no signs of improvement. So, respectfully, I'm with you that a large portion of the debt originated with things that should be regarded as void ab initio for a true constitutionalist. But we don't have an easy exit. Default is not a responsible option. And we know this. We've examined at Goldwater every last one of the balanced budget amendment proposals Congress has suggested. And they have loopholes you can drive a truck through. But the most fundamental problem with each and every congressional balanced budget proposal is that it never changes the structural problem that has led to this exponential growth in debt. And that is the concentration of unlimited power to incur debt in the hands of the debtor. Our current system under the U.S. Constitution allows the debtor to set whatever credit limit he wants. But think about what that means. Imagine if you were running a bank and somebody came to you and said, hey, give me a loan. And you say, how much? Whatever I want. And you said, okay, here you go. Set your own limit, knock yourself out. Would it be any surprise that you would get an exponential debt curve like we just started with? How could it be any other way? It's not possible given the nature of man and self-interest. And what's worse is, in a democratic system, or at least a partially democratic system, supposedly operating within the strictures of a Republican form of government, the problem with democracy is it does not check the abuse of debt. And here's why. And it can't check the abuse of debt. Who votes? You do. Who doesn't vote? Your kids and their kids. Who gets saddled with the costs of borrowing. Your kids and their kids. Who benefits from the borrowing today? You do. So who do you think the politician is going to listen to more often? The people demanding more debt spending? Or the future generations who have no vote, are silent and saddled with the costs? Of course, there's going to be a good representative here and there, but structurally, what is going to be the normal trend of that design? It will be to continuously burden non-voting future generations for no other reason than they cannot compete with current voting generations for the attention of politicians. They can't be heard. To expect current politicians, even good-hearted politicians, to represent the interests of non-voting future generations as effectively as current voting generations is as absurd as expecting a Southern elected official in the times of slavery to represent with a good heart the interests of the slaves as well as the interests of the non-slaves. They just can't, you just cannot do it. The incentives are all aligned against it. It is no wonder that when you combine unlimited power to incur debt in the hands of a Democratic elected representative without any fundamental law checking it, that you get this absurd spiral that we've seen over the past 30 to 40 years. Now, this is not a new observation. The problem of debt corrupting our constitutional government was recognized in 1798. Guess by who? In 1798, Thomas Jefferson wrote to a friend, and he was already upset at the pork barrel spending that was going on, even at a time when the Constitution was probably enforced about 95% of what it should have meant. And leaving aside the Alien Sedition Acts, we'll get to that later. Even then, Thomas Jefferson said, you know, I wish we had one more amendment. And this one amendment would reduce our government, our federal government, to its original founding constitutional purposes, and that would be an amendment taking away the federal government's power to borrow. Now, why did he say that? Because he recognized that in order for the federal government to grow beyond its constitutional boundaries, it needs the illusion of unlimited resources to propel that argument, to make it salable. Look, we have all this money, we just have to use it and we can do anything. For the non-philosophical constituents, or the corrupt, that's a powerful argument. Unlimited resources? What, this little parchment here is going to stop us from using those unlimited resources to do unlimited good? So the problem that Thomas Jefferson recognized is that borrowing frames up the political debate in a way that people who believe in a limited government cannot win. You go up against somebody who says, look at all the unlimited resources that replicator machine can generate. We can just have anything we want. Vote for me. Versus, no we can't. And yet in reality they can borrow and borrow and borrow till your generations beyond when the problem started. Is it any wonder that these guys on this side of the debate have continuously won for 200 years? So we have to get rid of this illusion of unlimited debt, not because we just are debt mongers and we just don't like debt. It's because it is the source of the illusion of unlimited resources that has propelled the growth of the federal government. And if we create a limit on debt, then we can finally have a limit on the appearance of resources, and with a limited amount of resources we can start winning the debate over what should be prioritized, what roles the federal government should have, what roles it shouldn't have. You never get to that debate against the guy who has a replicator machine to do anything. So, what is our solution? Well, I first want to emphasize this. The balanced budget amendment concept that we're advancing at Goldwater Institute in 4 states right now, Arizona, Arkansas, Alaska, and Georgia, is not perfect. It's not perfect. By design, it's not perfect. The reason why is you've got to get to 38 states. 3/4 of the states have to ratify. There are some very dark blue, purple states in those 38 states. So you cannot, if you're serious about this effort, you cannot start with perfection as the standard, because then everyone will know you've got no chance of ever succeeding, and you will have no impact. That being said, it's incredibly powerful. I'm going to walk you through it. I'm going to show you how this can finally change the debate in Washington. First of all, we're stopping the gaming with budgets. very, very easy to define a balanced budget if you want to be honest about it. You limit spending to cash on hand. And cash that originates from taxes, not from Ben Bernanke and now Ms. Yellen's printing press. So we begin the balanced budget amendment with a very simple, non-gameable, non-cheatable definition of balance. You cannot spend more than what you have in tax revenue at any point in time. It doesn't matter what you project, doesn't matter what you write in your budget, doesn't matter, none of that matters. You simply cannot spend it if it isn't in the bank and if it didn't originate from taxes. Now we do allow for one exception. You're probably going to say to me, well, what's that exception? But you're probably going to also say, some of you who've run a business, how do you run anything if you're strictly limited to the cash you have in the bank at all points in time? Because sometimes the cash isn't in the bank, and your obligations, even for legitimate things, are coming due. Well, it turns out the only way to make this non-gameable, non-cheatable definition of balance to work, the only way to make it work, if you want something that can't be cheated, is to have a revolving line of credit. You have to have a revolving line of credit so that you can handle the volatility in cash flow, so that you can make sure that you don't just shut down government anytime the tax flows are less than the spending flows for perfectly legitimate reasons. Think of it this way. A lot of businesses don't have cash on hand to make payroll week after week after week. It is very typical and ordinary for businesses to make payroll from time to time when there's cash flow problems to tap a line of credit at the bank. It's temporary. It's meant to handle volatility. It's normal. And so what we're saying here is you have to have a non-gameable definition of balance, but then you have to recognize that the price of having something that can't be gamed is a revolving line of credit. So you're probably going to say, what does that mean? Well, that means our constitutional amendment would specifically limit the available credit to the federal government. So you have an absolute dollar amount that you can draw on and nothing more to start. That initial amount we project, we indicate, you need to have some sort of transition phase to figure out how to start balancing your budget, deal with scarcity and debt, but we initially set it at 105% of the outstanding debt when it's ratified, which means basically you get 5% more debt as a cushion. At current borrowing and spending rates, we call burn rates, that would give Congress a year to 2 years to figure out how they're going to deal without any more debt. So you get that extra cushion for Congress then to figure out, well, see, I'm borrowing 45 cents of every dollar I'm spending. I know that I'm going to run out in a year or two. What am I going to do? Well, the one thing you can't do with this proposal is have Congress write its own credit limit. Under the current system, Congress just lifted its own statutory debt limit 3 times. In February, in October, and now in February. In February again, this year. Right now, there is no federal statutory debt limit. They can borrow, the sky's the limit. Whatever they can get away with, whatever they can sell to the bond market, Congress can do. So we know it does not work to allow for that initially fixed debt limit to be lifted or raised or increased by Congress alone. We have to have someone other than the debtor setting his own credit limit. It has to be someone outside of Congress for that to be something that doesn't just get lifted all the time. Now you're probably going to say, well, who should that be? Who would that be? Well, what we propose is a referendum to the states and require, if you want any increase in the federal debt limit, you've got to get the approval of 26 state legislatures. Now, keep in mind that the states, when they control the U.S. Senate through proxies, basically 26 states controlled half of the whole legislative power of the federal government. That was the original design before the 17th Amendment. What we're doing with this is we're bringing the states back into national policy making, but only in a small and targeted way. A way that is channeled directly to the problem area we can all agree on, that it is debt. So if you believed in the pre-17th Amendment world where the states appointed U.S. senators, if you thought that that was a good way of organizing our federal government to ensure that the states, which are more responsible to you, would have a voice in national policy, then you should support this far less extensive grant of power to the states, which was encompassed by that original design. The power to approve or disapprove any increase in the federal debt. Now you're probably going to say to me, well, that doesn't mean that you won't get the debt when you want it. No, it doesn't. As I said from the beginning, this is not perfect. In a perfect world, we'd have a 45% sequester tomorrow, right? We just cut out all the, because no doubt 55% of the current budget could be entirely focused on the core functions of the federal government without a problem. But that's not going to happen politically. So we have to first be worried about what can we do that stops the bleeding, that doesn't violate any principles, but makes things better than the status quo. No one can tell me that we are better off with Congress having unilateral control over its credit limit than under a system where you have at least an additional hurdle that is closer to the American people, where we do win a few battles from time to time. I mean, we did block healthcare exchanges in 36 states. We came darn close to 26 states in blocking Medicaid expansion. Arizona's not one of them, but 23 states rejected what looked like free federal money to some legislators. 23 states. So this is a battle where when you're arrayed against powerful special interests, you can win. And you certainly have a better chance of winning than you do in Congress, as we've seen last week, in October, and in February. So it's not perfect. But does it increase your odds of bringing scarcity to debt to Washington? Oh, heck yeah. There's no question it does. And that is all it will take for Washington to no longer think it has a replicator machine, and to start planning for scarcity and debt, and to start prioritizing, finally. And with prioritization will come the next debate that we all want to get to, which is what should the federal government do? You can't get to that ultimate question without first having limited resources, prioritization, then you can finally get back to first principles. Remember, we're not dealing with a nation of philosopher kings. Now, you're probably going to say, who's going to enforce the debt limit? Because here's the problem. Nobody knows what the heck the federal government is doing all the time. Not even the federal government. I mean, there's money being spent that nobody knew was in the budget. There's money that was not spent that's still sitting in an account somewhere. So, you know, the reality is all this is airy-fairy, abstract nonsense until you have an enforcement mechanism. Now, reality will enforce itself eventually, but we're trying to avoid the crash. We want to have a structure in place that makes people responsible in advance. Here's what we suggest. You know how President Obama always starts threatening Social Security and veterans benefits and stuff during the debt limit debates? Well, let me just, first of all, emphasize this. That's called an impoundment. The presidency has the implied power, even under an originalist understanding of the Constitution, to impound spending for which no money exists. Think about it. If not enough taxes come in, and yet there's a certain amount of appropriations that have to be spent, only the executive branch can be in the position of saying, I'm going to pay these, not pay these, I'll get to those later, I won't get to... So, realize, first of all, that what President Obama is doing in saying he'll delay some payments and defer others, in principle, it is not necessarily an abuse of power. It is, in fact, in times of scarce tax revenue, something that the executive branch just has to do. Just like if you're running a business and there's not enough money coming in, you got to pay some bills and not others. You delay some, you pay some faster. That cannot be avoided in a world where there isn't constant money flow. Okay? The problem, of course, is that it is abused. And it's primarily abused because it's used at the very last minute, usually, and it's used vaguely, right? He's never on record saying, I really will cut Social Security exactly this amount on this day. And that's my seal of approval on depriving you of all your Social Security. He always just kind of rumors it, like, it's going to happen, we might not have any choice. But he doesn't want his name on that proposal, because that will come back to him and his party. So the current system allows the power structure to have the best of both worlds. They can threaten all these horrible things with just the bugaboo kind of scarce, vagueness, and you never know exactly what's going to happen or how. It maximizes fear. Everyone panics. Midnight hour, they lift the debt limit, and we get to spend as much as we want to get. Right? That's how it happens time and time and time again. And I'm not so sure that everyone is in on that game, on both sides of the aisle. Right? So how do we stop that? Here's how the amendment proposes. As soon as you get to 98% of the debt limit, so say it was, just for sake of clarity, say it was a $100 million debt limit. As soon as you hit 98, million of that debt limit and borrowing. We've got $2 million left to go. It says the president must start designating those impoundments. Now, what does that mean realistically? A 2%, assuming we say ratified this amendment in 2 years, you had a $21 trillion debt limit, and we are at $20 trillion, and we get up to 98% of that, which would be, I don't know, say 750, 600 billion or so. You get 300 to 400 billion dollars of additional space to borrow. Well, that means that at current borrowing and spending rates, we would have between 3 and 6 months before hitting the debt limit. Okay? So the way the structure works is that the president, 3 to 6 months before hitting that midnight hour, 3 to 6 months before it, would actually have to lay out what he's going to delay, what he's not going to pay, what he's going to prioritize, in a specific proposal that perfectly protects the debt limit, which means under current borrowing rates, 45% of the budget would have to be identified as being impounded. And so basically the president now, with 3 to 6 months to go, has to now identify 45% of the budget that he is going to impound under the current debt limit. Now, first of all, that's a lot of power, don't get me wrong, but it's implicit. Right now, only now they get to wait to the midnight hour to do it. So we're pushing that back to allow for a robust debate. And we're not just letting the president do this on his own. We're actually giving Congress the ability to override his proposed impoundments within 30 days with alternatives. So now we've got both people on the table with their cards face up. We know exactly what is going to be cut or not cut. We know who is doing what proposal, and we know this months before any panicky stuff starts. That's how you start a serious debate over what to do about our insane debt burden, what to do with our excessive spending, and what other opportunities there may be existing to engage in some sort of efficiencies. But you start that debate with everyone's numbers on the table. And you say to the president, if you don't play that game, if you don't propose those impoundments, you can be impeached. And you look at an explicit impeachment provision, which we have. Now you're probably saying, well, nobody will ever impeach the president. Wrong. Because there's one thing that Washington loves to engage in, and that is blame shifting. Think about it this way. Who passed the appropriations in the first place that are going to butt up against that debt that have to be ignored? Congress. So just imagine a world where the president did not do his impoundments. Let's just say the president says, I'm not going to do that. I'm not putting my neck on that table and tell everybody how I'm cutting 45%. What would happen then is Congress would never have an opportunity to propose anything different. Those appropriations then, those excessive appropriations that nobody can comply with because we don't have enough debt, would remain outstanding, and then we'd run up to the debt limit, and the debt limit spending requirement would say you can't spend more than your taxes, so you would automatically get a 45% sequester on spending if nobody did anything. It would be chaos. It would be whatever bills can't be paid. But everyone would know who to blame. The president. He didn't do what he was supposed to do. And if they didn't blame the president, who gets the blame then? Congress. So wouldn't Congress have a natural incentive to commence impeachment proceedings? They just make sure that everyone keeps looking at the president? Of course they would. If they didn't, their necks would be on the line for a 45% sequester. So this is a very powerful enforcement mechanism that a politically savvy president will recognize. They play several steps ahead in these games. And it will encourage everyone, again, to do what the structure provides. Put your cards on the table with 3 to 6 months before hitting the limit so you can figure out what you're going to do next. Now, you're probably going to say that next might be a terrible tax increase. So let me just first emphasize this. Debt is taxes. Where do you think the money's coming from? To pay it back. So if we're ever going to pay that crazy exponential growth curve in debt, it means taxes. And taxes are the worst kind. Taxes on future non-voting, unrepresented generations. In other words, taxation without representation. The very thing that our Constitution was designed to prevent, that the Revolution was designed to stop, is what debt will be. Taxation without representation. So if you really did have to make a choice between debt, unlimited debt, saddling future generations with unlimited taxes, or raising taxes now to close that deficit, for which people could be politically accountable now by the people burdened by any increase in taxes. That's just the right thing to do. It is morally wrong to prefer shifting the costs of our policy choices to our kids and their kids than to own them ourselves and to punish the political actors that we can punish today for them. It's simply wrong. Now, that being said, we don't want to destroy our seed corn, right? You can have really bad tax policies that could completely destroy our growth capacity and make it impossible to pay anything back. So you need, and Congress is stupid enough to do stuff like that. So you need to have some kind of protection. The question is how? How do you protect the seed corn from being overtaxed without sacrificing future generations to our policy choices? Where's the balance? Here is the proposal that we've made. First of all, you start with a general rule that you cannot get any tax increase or any new tax without supermajorities of each House of Congress. And that is supermajorities of the whole number of each House of Congress, not a quorum. So this is a higher hurdle than congressionally proposed amendments. Now you're going to probably say, well, what do we just do about the future generations? That means they're going to get stuck. We can't. Well, here's how we protect the future generations. This first of all, gives us a default setting that tends to minimize taxes that are new or increased. We create a number of exceptions. And exceptions that are very clever, if you just bear with me. First of all, we create an exception where you could completely swap out the income tax for an end user, not a VAT, an end user sales tax, what some people call the fair tax. So if you wanted to get more revenue through simple majorities rather than jumping through that 2/3 hurdle, one option would be to get rid of every form of the income tax and replace it with a sales tax. And then you could get more revenues if you could pass the bill. Another option would be to close deductions, credits, and exemptions in existing taxes, flattening the tax code. That could be done also with simple majorities. And then lastly, you could raise tariffs or fees. Tariffs are the things that you apply to trade. It's actually how the federal government used to be primarily funded under the original design. So with simple majorities, you could get more revenue if needed to close that deficit through these three avenues. Now you're probably going to say, oh my God, the home deduction goes away, everything goes away, we're all going to get taxed to the hill. Think about the special interest pushback that comes every time someone tries to broaden the sales tax base, or flatten the income tax, or getting rid of a particular deduction. You never see so much special interest pushback. So in fact, what this is doing is this is channeling the drive for more tax revenue to the most difficult places to get it. It doesn't make it even more easy than the status quo. It makes it harder because nobody's going to try to hit that supermajority vote. They're all going to try to ram this thing through simple majority votes where the pushback from the interests that benefit from having the income tax as opposed to a sales tax, having the deduction as opposed to not having the deduction, having the tariff where it is as opposed to where it might be raised, where that pushback will push back incredibly strongly. Maybe even more strongly than a 2/3 hurdle, or close to it. And that means that to overcome that special interest pushback, you really got to need that revenue, right? To have the political will to win that political battle in a significant way, your motives have got to be pretty darn close to pure to win that political fight. And so what we have done with this compromise is make a principled compromise, in that it is no worse than the current status quo. The current status quo, you can layer on one tax after another with simple majorities. The taxing power, as currently interpreted, has no limit, effectively, under the Constitution. So we're not making anything worse. Instead, we're making it a lot better. We're forcing the debate for more revenues into places where it's less likely to be generated, unless there's just overwhelming need for it. Truly overwhelming need, enough to overcome powerful special interests. So that's how you don't sacrifice the future generations to the current, or the current generations to the future, and you protect the seed corn at the same time. Now let me ask you something. What is the chance that this will ever be proposed by Congress? Exactly. That's why we need Article 5, folks. Because this kind of reform is simply not ever going to happen from Congress. These are the benefits of the amendment that we've just gone through. But the most important thing, again, I have to emphasize is this. We have taken away the unlimited and unilateral power to write its own credit limit from Congress. No longer will the debtor decide the extent of its credit. It will require intervention from the bodies that are closest to us in this system, which is our state legislatures. They're not perfect, but at least they listen to us more often than Congress does. And it's not surprising. They're earlier in their careers, easier to find, they're harder for them to run away from you. I mean, it's just socially, you have an advantage trying to persuade your legislature than you do Congress or Senator McCain. And that in and of itself will skew the debate over debt in our favor. It won't mean we win every battle, but it will be better than the status quo. So there we are again. Back to the amendment process. We have no choice but to look to the states for this kind of reform. So, you're probably going to say, well, that's great, let's go do it. Believe it or not, Article 5 is very, very difficult. So I want everybody here to understand that this next half of the presentation is all about how difficult Article 5 is and why I think the best way to go about using Article 5 is using a compact, an agreement among the states. I'm going to conclude this presentation ultimately on showing how the founders agree with that strategy. Clearly and unequivocally. In fact, it is impossible to find a founder who opposed the use of Article 5 in a targeted way by the states. Impossible. And I will prove that at the end. But for now, who here knew that Patrick Henry hated the Constitution? He hated it. He wasn't alone. George Mason, too. You know what was remarkable about George Mason? George Mason was a South Carolinian, a slave state. And one of the main reasons he opposed the Constitution was its compromise in slavery. He would not have any part of it. As a Southerner, he knew it was wrong. He knew that the posterity would be looking back on that compromise as just a disaster. So these are not, just bomb-throwing jerks. These were incredibly principled, wise, courageous human beings who opposed, who hated. Hate is not too strong a word. They hated the Constitution. And Patrick Henry spent nearly 6 hours during the Virginia ratification debates opposing the convention, opposing the Constitution, saying one of the worst aspects about it was the state origination of amendments. Because he said nobody could ever get through it. It was a fraud, it was a ruse. There was no way the states would ever rein in the federal government using this power. And he said that in a time when there were only 13 states. Let's look at it when there's now 50. You need over 100 legislative acts to actually use it. Over 100. There's never been a concerted legislative effort that has racked up more than 40, 48, and that was for the Uniform Commercial Code in a human lifetime. It just never happened, okay? Now you're saying, well, how's that so? You got to have 34 state applications. These require resolutions to be passed in each house of each state legislature. Some states, like Alaska, do require gubernatorial signatures. You can't evade your governor in some states. Then you need Congress to do its constitutional duty. Article 5 says Congress shall call the convention. Everybody said it's their obligation, but Congress always follows the Constitution. We got nothing to worry about, right? Well, the problem is that the Constitution doesn't mean a whole lot to the bad actors in Congress all the time. And so we don't know that Congress will actually pass the call. So we have to treat that like another piece of legislation. Then somebody's got to go to the convention. That means at least 26 states, a quorum of any kind of the states, needs to pass laws that identify who's going. That's another 26 pieces of legislation. Now, assuming the convention actually does anything, and my great fear of the convention is not that it's going to run away or do crazy stuff. My great fear is that of any committee, a large number of politicians in a big room, what makes us think they're going to do anything of any value at all? More likely they do nothing. But let's assume that they do something. Again, Congress shall refer it out to the states. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. You have to assume that they're going to have to go through a normal resolution process to pass that. And then you need 38 states to ratify it. And by the way, Congress gets to choose between state legislatures and in-state conventions. And not every state has the legal framework for their convention anymore. The last time, and the only time it was ever used was for the repeal of prohibition. So that could involve not only just, even with the legislative side, you'd have to do one piece of the legislation, but if you have to reestablish your convention laws, it might take 2, 3, or 4 pieces of legislation. So you're well above 100 pieces of legislation. And when there were just 13 states involved, Patrick Henry said this was a fraud, this was a ruse, nobody could ever get through it. What do you think he'd say now? His head would explode, probably. So, and that's just the beginning of the problems. I think we should always question politics. I'm here as an advocate for Article 5, but I'm here as an honest advocate to tell you the real facts about the process. Not here to sugarcoat anything. One of the things that we have to recognize is that Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan could not succeed when they tried in the 1970s and 80s. I'm no Ronald Reagan. I don't know any Milton Friedmans today. Those men failed. Okay? They didn't even get past the first hurdle. The other thing we have to point out is, one of the reasons why these things fail, why they've never really been successful, is that nobody has ever tried to define the amendment in advance. They've always talked about it in generalities. Unlike the amendment we've already mapped out, they'll say, let's have a balanced budget amendment discussion and hope something good comes up. Well, that's a hard sales point. I mean, how do you rally so many hundreds and thousands of legislators passing things when all you have is like a hope and a dream? I mean, I'm all for hopes and a dream, and that's all we got, but this is hard. And then the ratification time. It's anyone's guess when you're going to actually get the amendment up. It could be 3 months, it could be 200 years. So understand that the Article 5 process, indeed, is probably the only process that will ever generate anything that really restricts congressional power. But this is not a cakewalk. This is incredibly difficult. And this is why at the Goldwater Institute we put our heads together about 2 years ago and tried to find a better way. And I think we have. Here's what we've done. We've compressed the entire amendment process into 2 overarching pieces of legislation. One state compact. It's just a fancy name for an agreement that 38 states will have to join. So 38 pieces of legislation on one side. One congressional resolution, passed once, in and out of Congress, just one time. So you go from over 100 pieces of legislation down to 39 total. Still not the easiest push, but let me show you what's in it. In the compact, you have the proposed amendment, specified in complete detail. We've just gone through it. In the compact, you have a commission that's formed as soon as 2 states join it to handle all the logistics of this very complicated process. Basically making sure everyone joins it and all the rules are enforced. In the compact, you have that application to Congress. Now, we've used what's called a conditional enactment so that it goes live only when 38 states join the compact. Why 38 states? That's the number you need for ratification. Why even start this process if you can't get to the ratification at the beginning? Once 38 states join the compact and the congressional resolution, it triggers the first part of the resolution, which is the call. We've divided up the resolution into 2 titles. The first is the call. It only goes live when the application to Congress goes live in the compact. When that goes live, the delegates who are already specified in the compact, in Arizona's version right now, we have the 3 delegates specified, the governor, the speaker, and the Senate president. When they get to the convention, which is given a default designation of Dallas, Texas, as a central location, the first order of business is they have to vote into place rules that limit the vote to up or down on that specific amendment. Because you have 38 states going there, you've got a control over any kind of quorum that might exist. You also have a further backup protection in the compact that says that all the member states agree not to ratify anything that might be generated from the compact, or from the convention, other than the proposed amendment we talked about. Not only that, but it tells every member state, all 38 of them, that they can't even participate in the convention unless those convention rules hold. And it even nullifies anything that might be generated as void ab initio if it isn't the amendment that is being contemplated. Assuming that the amendment is approved, it could be voted down, but assuming it's approved, then in the congressional resolution, it triggers a ratification referral that's already in the resolution you passed. As soon as that's triggered, in the compact was a preloaded ratification designed to go live only if the convention proposed the amendment and Congress referred it out for ratification. Bingo. We call this a turnkey approach to Article 5. Everything is in just two overarching pieces of legislation. And notice this, you're in and out of each state once. You're in and out of Congress once. In principle, you can campaign this out in a single session year. This is not a multi-staged, infinite quest to some day that we might have an amendment. So, these are the benefits of the compact approach. Now, a couple of points on the benefit of going to Congress with a compact as opposed to anything else. First of all, if you don't have a compact, all you get is a stack of paper. Congress doesn't really care about stacks of paper. There's lots of stacks of paper in Congress. Second, we know that Congress, if you don't have a compact, will try to basically make the convention a mini-Congress. How do we know that? Because they've already passed out of the Senate twice bills to do just that, to basically populate the convention very similarly to the way that Congress is populated. So that basically Congress gets to generate amendments with a lower voting threshold than they would at home. The other benefit of this is, look, anytime you need to get Congress to call a convention, it has to be by simple majorities. If the political will exists for calling the convention without a compact, why wouldn't it exist for approving the resolution? And wouldn't you rather go to Congress just once instead of having to go twice? And here's the other great thing about the congressional component. You don't have to wait for everyone to join the compact. You can run it at any time because the components go live only when the right thresholds are triggered. So you could pass the congressional component today, even before a compact has been formed. You can pass it when there's 20 states in the compact, when there's 5, when there's 30, whenever the hole in the line opens. And we know that even with congressional proposed balanced budget amendments, there's almost always been simple majority support for those concepts, as bad as they were, in Congress. So this is very plausible. Bottom line is, this is a plausible way of handling Article 5. All of these reasons support that case. And then lastly, for those of you afraid of a runaway convention, the idea that despite being in the straitjacket, maybe the convention will do crazy things. I actually had Andy Schlafly, Phyllis Schlafly's son, a constitutional attorney and scholar, peer review the compact. I don't know where he stands on it today, but he asked for one safeguard after another, and we said, we'll give you anything you want. And we basically exhausted him at safeguard 16, and even since then we've added a couple more. So we have basically made this compact so much safer than the ordinary legislative process that we entrust to Congress every day that we think that it would be absurd, given the benefits that you can obtain only from Article 5, not to use this process. Keeping in mind that Congress, every day it meets, is a convention for proposing amendments. Under current case law, Congress could propose amendments with 2/3 of a quorum, which could be just barely more than a simple majority. So if you're comfortable with that, you should be comfortable with this. Doesn't get any safer. Now, last part of the discussion, and this is entirely to show you that what we've done in the compact is perfectly constitutional. And in fact, anyone saying otherwise is just so wrong. I just have to stomp my feet and just say, you're wrong. All right. First thing, people who oppose Article 5 say that the Philadelphia Convention that generated the convention was an illegal runaway convention, and that somehow sets the precedent for every convention ever done since then to be illegal and runaway. Now first let me just emphasize the non sequitur, illogic of that statement. Let's suppose for the moment that they were right, that in fact the Philadelphia Convention had been an illegal convention. Why does it follow that then every convention is therefore legally illegal? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. But the truth is, it didn't run away. You can go now online to the Online Library of Liberty and see exactly what it was charged to do. That is a quote from the congressional resolution, and it was mirrored in most of the state commissions of most of the attending states. 11 of the attending states had this similar language. It said that their purpose is to establish a firm national government, to render the federal constitution adequate to the exigencies of government and the preservation of the Union, revising the articles with the alterations and provisions. Now, it's a myth that they were there only to amend the Constitution, amend the articles. They were actually there to revise it. An early version of the congressional resolution said amend, they replaced it with the word revise. At the time, revise meant potentially a total rewrite. You ever heard of revised statutes? Revised statutes is a term that's been used to rewrite all the laws. Not only that, but courts of appeal in many of the states at this time were known as courts of revisal. Courts of appeal overturned lower courts. So revising the articles, it contemplated a total rewrite. Not necessarily, but as a possibility. And with this sort of limitation, you don't have to be James Madison to make the case, which he did, by the way, in Federalist number 40, that they did exactly what they were told to do. Now, the better argument for the people who say that the Philadelphia Convention was an illegal runaway convention is that its ratification requirement deviated from the Articles. The Articles required unanimous consent of all the states. The Convention didn't. I mean, the Constitution didn't. Well, this has already been answered by historians, and the general recognition is that the whole reason why we had the Philadelphia Convention is that everyone was breaching the Articles of Confederation. They were disregarding its provisions, and under international law at the time, because the Articles was merely a treaty among sovereign states, it didn't have any binding qualities. So there was nothing about the ratification requirements of the Articles of Confederation that actually had any legal force at the time. Another point that many people make is that the Constitution, even though it originally did not require unanimity, it eventually was unanimously approved by all states and by Congress in full conformity with the Articles. And in fact, before that happened, the Articles were still effective in those states that did not ratify. So the bottom line is there's just no truth to this view of the Philadelphia Convention, that somehow our nation was born of an illegal runaway convention. And even if there were any truth in it, and there isn't, but even if there were, it doesn't follow that because you had one illegal convention, all conventions must be illegal. It doesn't follow. All right. The other thing that people have to recognize is that the founders were unanimous on Article 5 being controlled and targeted by the states to get to the amendments that they wanted. They said it over and over and over again. They never said the contrary, ever, not once, never. Proof. Federalist number 43. What were the Federalist Papers? They were the points, the sales points for ratifying the Constitution. This was not irrelevant nonsense. This was the reason why people were told to ratify the Constitution. Federalist 43 by James Madison said specifically, Article 5 equally enables the general, meaning the national, and the state governments to originate the amendment of errors. Equally. Now, would equally mean that the states have no control over the convention process? Or does it mean that they can do, through the convention, exactly what Congress can do on its own? Still not satisfied? During the Virginia Ratification Convention, after Patrick Henry's grand speech about how everything was bad about the Constitution, and in particular Article 5 was a fraud, George Nicholas rose. Now, George Nicholas was a young man at the time, relatively, but he was the leader of the Federalists, the pro-ratification side. And he said it would be natural that an Article 5 convention would be confined to a few points. That the states applying for a convention will concur in the ratification of the proposed amendments. Now, obviously, he was contemplating that the convention was just an instrumentality for the states to achieve whatever amendments they wanted. It wasn't this magic button of destruction that runs wild by its design. It's just not true. If you don't believe that, and mind you, this is not just pillow talk. Right? I mean, the public understanding of what they were getting into at ratification matters. So whether this guy, in his secret mind, really believed what he said or not, doesn't matter. This is the representation upon which people relied when they ratified the Constitution. Federalist 85, the last of the Federalist Papers, was entirely devoted to assuring the states that they would have control over the Article 5 process to attain the amendments that they wanted. This was the closing argument for ratification. This is the most important argument for ratification, entirely devoted to how the states could erect barriers using their amendment power. Does that in any way suggest that the convention, by its nature, must do whatever the heck it wants, regardless of what the states say? No, it doesn't. Now, Phyllis Schlafly and folks with her, and by the way, she's deserving of great respect on all other issues except this one, so bear with me. Phyllis Schlafly will borrow this part from here down of James Madison's quote from 1788 and say, this is proof James Madison thought the convention process was inherently uncontrollable because he thought it would have greater latitude than Congress. And he goes on to talk about how horrible things could be and so on. Right? But she never tells you about the starting quote. Because James Madison was giving his opinion of a specific convention proposal that was on the table by people who hated the Constitution in New York. At the time that the ratification debates were happening, there was an effort in New York, led by people like Patrick Henry and George Mason, to scuttle the entire Constitution, to have a second constitutional convention, and to just start over. And so when Madison was asked what his opinion was of the convention, he was referring to another general convention as suggested by New York. Naturally, he was opposed to having a second constitutional convention starting over from scratch because he rather liked the Constitution. And his criticism that is taken out of context and frankly dishonestly by Phyllis Schlafly needs to be recognized for what it is. A dishonest representation of what James Madison said. Dishonest. And it's not excusable any longer. Because it's not just then, at the time of ratification of James Madison, emphasized how Article 5 could be controlled. Who here is aware of nullification? Anybody here aware of nullification? Remember the Virginia resolutions when the Alien Sedition Act was nullified or attempted to be nullified by Virginia, and I believe it was Kentucky as well? Well, James Madison said that in addition to nullification, the states could use Article 5 for the object of proposing an explanatory amendment to repeal the Alien Sedition Act. So James Madison not only thought that the Article 5 process could be controlled by the states, but it could be so finely tuned that you could even propose a constitutional amendment directed to repealing specific legislation. That's how finely tuned and controlled he thought this process was. So the idea that he thought that by its nature the Amendments Convention runs away and does crazy stuff is just not true. Now, maybe James Madison is not the last word on this. But on his deathbed, right after the controversies of the Missouri Compromise, when everybody was talking nullification again, there he was again, saying, guys, use Article 5. You can fix those problems in the Constitution that everybody's focused on right now with the slavery expanding to the territories and so on, by having a process applicable by the states. Now again, implicit in this is that it can be targeted to the specific issues that were in dispute. Not that it was a blow-up button, that we just, start over everything. It's just not true. And then of course, and I rest my case on this last slide, we have George Washington's own words. George Washington was not just the founder of our country. He wasn't just the chairman of the Philadelphia Convention, and therefore kind of knew what people were thinking there. But George Washington did the one thing that has been almost inconceivable then and since, and that is having had the opportunity to have total power, to become the king of our nation, and to walk away from that, and to return as a citizen. The integrity that a man requires to have that choice, to make that choice, is so immense. That's why we revere him. He was a true citizen of the Republic. And he wrote to his friends, do not fear ratifying the Constitution because 9 states can get whatever amendment they deem necessary. 9 states was 2/3. 2/3 was the threshold for calling a convention. If the convention was not an instrumentality of the desires of the states, did he lie? He didn't lie. Everything the founders said at the time of the founding is consistent with what George Washington said. Everything. There is no founding era evidence that suggests otherwise. Article 5 was meant to be controlled by the states. It is controllable by the states with the compact for a balanced budget, and we need to use it before it's too late. Thank you very much.